Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer. Hey everyone, welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon, physician scientist at the University of Colorado. And today we're going to be talking about the pharmaceutical industry. Joining me is Samantha Murrell and Kerry Wentworth. Why don't you both take a second to introduce yourselves? We'll start with Samantha.
Hey everyone, Samantha, happy to be here. I have non-small cell lung cancer. I just had to think about that then, which is wild. Non-small cell lung cancer with a HER2 mutation. It's great to be here as always. Kerry, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to join both of you today in this discussion. I'm Kerry Wentworth. I'm currently the Chief Regulatory Officer at Nuvation Bio, but crossed the 30-year mark this spring in the pharmaceutical/biotech industry. So it's gone fast. So pleasure to be with you all today.
It evolved quite a bit over that time period.
A lot.
Yeah. And, before we kick off, I just want to say thank you for coming on. We've reached out to quite a few pharmaceutical groups, and it's a lot of risk for someone in the pharmaceutical industry to come on any outspoken content machine here, and a podcast forum is certainly that. I think probably, I imagine from a pharmaceutical standpoint, there's potential for risk and it may not necessarily be worth it. But Nuvation and you, Kerry, have offered to come on and answer some of the questions that we have about the pharmaceutical industry with asking nothing in return. So we want to make that clear. We're not sponsored by you or anything. Just wanted to come on and have an open dialogue to help inform the community about what's going on. And maybe to kick off, the first question I really had, and to Kerry, this is to you, is what would you say is the overall goal of a given pharmaceutical company?
Well, I guess I could point back to the logo. I don't even know or the mission, if you will. I say the logo, but really not the logo. The mission of Nuvation Bio, and that is driven by science, focused on life. And I think the overall mission, really, if you step back, is to bring healthier, longer living to people. To me, that's, to boil it down, that's why I've been in the business for as long as I've been in the business, and continue to just gain such inspiration from my coworkers and from patients and the mission.
Yeah, and I'm noticing, the first thing you're mentioning is, a people-centered mission, where I think a lot of times when people think of pharmaceutical companies, they think of metrics. They think of quarterly missions, of, certain financial incentives. But you're mentioning the reason you've been in this industry for, quite a few decades is patient-centered, people-centered. Can you speak a little more to that?
I think it all begins depends on where you can come into the industry. And starting back in 1994 and having the pleasure of joining a company called Genzyme. I don't know if you've heard of, Genzyme. It was a small, at the time, biotech company in Cambridge, where it was all focused on the patient, rare diseases. And for me, that was the kind of the first impression I had, was so much focus on making a difference in these patients' lives. And it was young patients. And that was it for me. I think that I then would just, the next opportunity where I'd move to another company, it had to be patient focused, or I don't know. I wouldn't have emotionally connected with it, which is so important if you're going to put in the time and the hours that it takes to take a drug from the beginning to the end. If you're so lucky, many fail in the process.
Yeah, and I definitely want to go more into that. But, something you mentioned is the opportunity to help people, patients in mind. And I'll say I'm in academia, I'm in an academic medical center, but a lot of my colleagues, individuals I trained with, who trained as physician scientists. Many go into industry because we feel, or they felt that they could do the most good there. It wasn't like I get more money there. It was really because there's a strong ability to solve problems using a lot of different tools and the patient's at the center. So I think when people think of pharmaceutical companies, that's not always the first thing that comes to mind. But having gone through the training process myself, I know a lot of people who have made that transition to working in pharmaceuticals, and it really was to make a bigger impact, because we only have one life, and you get the contributions you can make matter more to us than the money we can make. Yeah. So Samantha, what questions do you have?
Well, I just want to first off say that a very big misconception I think I had, and a lot of other people have, are that, as Kyle mentioned, it's all financial incentives. It's all, everyone's in this ivory tower and they're directing things, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I have met the nicest people in the pharmaceutical industry so far since my diagnosis, who truly care about their mission. And it's just fantastic to see. And I wish I could shout it from the rooftops. Wait, I am, I guess, in this way, to really let people know that these people truly do care and they really do want to make a difference. So I just wanted to start off by saying that, because I think it's a big misnomer out there.
I'm glad that you feel that way. I think that from where I sit, it's really, really difficult to soundbite drug development, and why are drugs, especially certain classes of drugs, priced the way they're priced. And I think it's impossible in 60 seconds to articulate everything that goes into it. And then if you try to do it, it sounds disingenuous.
Right. Right.
So I think the more transparency there is, the more that we can share the drug development journey. And that means the journey that has ended up in failure, but failure accrues to learning. And without that failure, which comes at a cost, you don't have your successes. So I'm glad, I'm so, heartened to hear that you have that impression. I would not want to work with jerks. And I've had, just a fabulous 30 years of working with great people. And so I'm really happy to hear that you have that impression.
Great. So what is your role, Kerry? I'd love to hear more about what you specifically do.
Sure. My title sounds awfully boring and disinteresting, but I'm the Chief Regulatory Officer. So my number one job under that title is to shepherd our drug development process through in alignment with different regulations and guidance documents that have been issued by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and globally. Right? We just don't develop we develop drugs obviously for the U.S. patient population, but we think much more broadly than that. And so I have to be cognizant of different regulations and guidance documents that exist outside of the United States. So that's number one. I also am responsible for a department called Quality Assurance. So we need to make sure that the products, whether they be in clinical trials or commercially available, that what we purport to describe in the label is truly what the patient is getting, either in the bottle or in the vial. And so that's important safeguard for the patient and for prescribers, of course. And then also on the program management side of things, medical writing, there's kind of a few different things underneath that, but that's where, day in and day out, I'm thinking, how do we get this developed in accordance with the regulations and guidances? And how do we work with the agency in a really kind of innovative way, if possible, to get needed medications to patients as quickly as possible. And I have to say that over the years, especially in oncology, FDA has done, I think, a remarkable job at being innovative, very thoughtful, very scientifically driven when it comes to partnering, if you will, and collaborating, not in a financial way, just with dialogue and with thought on how to move these important products forward.
Sounds like a very big responsibility that you have going on there.
It's fun because I get to see the whole process. So it's from the, not on the discovery side necessarily, but from the point that we identify a research candidate that we're going to take into what we call, these IND, so investigational new drug enabling toxicology studies. That kind of starts, you've started to get some efficacy signals in animal models, maybe some really good in vitro work. You say, okay, we're going to take this now into these more expensive animal studies that we will, and we're going to package this up and we're going to go to the FDA and say, look, we want to start to test this. In oncology, you're almost always going into patients. And so you see that part of it, you see the manufacturing development part of it, you see the clinical development part of it, you see then to get it to the market, and you see the life cycle management. So I've enjoyed seeing all those different aspects of the development process that, you don't get a seat to all of that activity in many of the other kind of functional areas.
Well, and building off that, Kerry, so I work in the preclinical world. We do stuff with cell lines. These are in petri dishes. We do stuff with mice. And then I don't think people appreciate just how much of that fails. You have an idea, you're evaluating for, you're looking for something new that might work better than what we've done before. And a lot of that fails. So I'm curious, your role in the pharmaceutical company here is to evaluate some candidate therapies that you might want to take into trial.
Yep.
And we have tools preclinically. Some are promising. Some have varying degrees of scientific rigor and how we're determining how promising it is. A lot of things work in mice that don't work in humans. We all know that. But, if you could summarize, I guess, how does a pharmaceutical company identify what therapy to test in a trial?
Well, a lot of it starts with, I would say, the work that is being published out of academia, out of the NIH. At least at small companies, we are not necessarily identifying the target, right? The novel target. We're evaluating the level of validation that target may have. And do we have either the medicinal chemistry that we are doing inside, or is there a compound outside of the company that we think could be effective in hitting that target? So at least in the span of my career, a lot of the drivers of disease are identified outside of the company, but we will be the one to develop the drug or the biologic to target that disease. And then to your point, you just put a bunch of screening models, you'll work on some backup compounds, you'll have a bake-off, right, of those, if you will, and if you have a good model, and identify the candidate that you will take forward into these, like I mentioned, those more expensive animal toxicology studies, because those are time-consuming and expensive, and you want to be pretty sure on the candidate that because if those don't go well, that obviously could be a real setback to getting into the clinic. How druggable is the target? Can you get enough drug to the target? I also think that is a big consideration. And is it a program? Is it a drug that you can develop in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable enough budget, right? Because there are maybe some indications and some drugs that make a lot of sense. But if it takes 10 years to get to an endpoint, find the patients, enroll them, study them, it can take a very long time. And so that just, companies just won't necessarily have the runway or the patience, not the physical patience, but the emotional patience to see that through. So all of that kind of needs to line up.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned keeping in mind, there are fiscal responsibilities that the pharmaceutical company does have. A lot of the fundraising these are not for profits. You have to make money on something. And then I think people don't necessarily have the full understanding of how much goes into setting up a trial, because you also need to be sure that the compound you're testing or the therapy you're testing has to work reasonably better than whatever else is out there. And if it works a small amount better, it's just a little bit better, that can still be fine, but you need a lot more patients. You need more center. Like there's the financials behind it. And if you don't set those things up right, the trial can be uninterpretable, which, in our mind in academia is like that's kind of a wasted trial if the numbers weren't high enough or the effect wasn't great enough for how many people there were. So it comes down to a lot of these pragmatic decisions. And if you go wrong, this is how companies fail.
Yeah. And we've seen, unfortunately, quite a bit of that over the last, I think, COVID, and then coming out of COVID, just the financing environment was not great. So at least where I live in the Boston area, there are a number of companies that literally shuttered and just went bankrupt. And that you just didn't see that as 10 years ago. It's really unfortunate. You just run out of money. It means there's sometimes that you just can't continue with the trial. And that's so unfortunate. That happens though.
So let's talk about clinical trials a little bit more in terms of, can you walk us through how a cancer clinical trial is designed? Love to get some insight there.
Sure. Well, 20 years ago, I would say, 15 years ago, the clinical trial would look very much the same. Every clinical trial, because you're mainly dealing with chemotherapy-driven type of therapies, not targeted. Just it's that carpet bombing approach, and hope it works. Escalate to the maximum tolerated dose, and hope you get some tumor response with a safe enough dose. Now, and I would say those are it's the best that we had, but those were not very intelligent trials at the end of the day. But the therapies were not that intelligent either. But now with the advent of precision medicine, targeted therapy, we can be so much smarter with our phase 1 trials. And I think that this is where the science and the FDA have really kind of come to a place where you can start maybe a trial with a slightly higher dose than you would with a traditional chemotherapy. You can escalate a little bit faster than you would have because you're smarter about patient selection. You're really trying to match up the patient with the drug target, and to me, that's just number one, you're putting much fewer patients at risk. You're put, for no benefit. You're moving along. Hopefully, if you have some signals of efficacy, you're moving that along in a more relevant patient population so you can make decisions faster. And you don't need that many patients either. I think that that's also really important. If you have something that is not working, you want to know that pretty quickly so you don't put more patients. Even if it's not a safety risk, you want to think about, well, could they go on to another trial? If they're going to pick your trial, that means they're foregoing another study. And you want them to go on the best trial. And so I do think that the way that we're designing phase 1 trials, phase 1 trials can go on for a long time and they become registrational trials now. And I think that just is a function of smarter medicine, which much better, smarter, and better patient selection, and at the end, it should yield hopefully better outcomes for patients.
And you're using the term phase 1 trials. I think some of our listeners may not know the different phases of trials. Can you explain what a phase 1 trial is?
It's, I think, almost becoming outdated terminology at this point in some respects, but phase 1 trials, we'll call them first in human, first in patient studies, where it's the first time that this new molecular entity or new biologic is moving from animal testing into human beings or patients. So you'll see first in human versus phase 1 necessarily, because in some areas of medicine, phase 1 and then moving to phase 2 and phase 3 still is in place, that more traditional clinical development schema. But now with, like I said, just smarter medicines with better patient selection and understanding the molecular features of different tumors. Now it's just these, you'll hear this term seamless clinical trial. And that's just where you're in your phase 1 study. You'll see now phase 1, phase 2 study. They just keep going because you're learning and then you're adapting that study. And if you're getting really good responses, you just keep enrolling patients and collect that data and present it to the FDA. It's not always like that. And we have a trial that's ongoing. That's not like that. But, there are a lot of examples that you can point to now where that phase 1, 2, 3, you just won't see that as much of that terminology.
Well, and elaborating on that a little bit, I know a concern I hear a lot, and I bet people on, who are going to be listening will have this concern too. They have apprehension to go on trials because they don't want to get a sugar pill. They don't want to get the placebo arm and not get treated. What could you say to maybe reassure folks about that?
In oncology, that has to be a pretty difficult decision for a patient. But when you have no other treatment options and you have depending on the study design, have a 50-50 chance of getting on potentially an active therapy. That's the thing. You don't really know. At the point where you're going to move to a randomized study like that, you have pretty good signal that you're going to have an active therapy. How active is a question. So you think I have a 50-50 chance or I have nothing. But in many instances, what we'll do is if that patient progresses, can unblind the patient and then cross them over, where we've committed to in the clinical study that they would then be put on the investigational drug or the active drug for participating. So that is one way to, I think, get patients to consider a trial that's placebo-controlled.
And a lot of times in these phase 1 trials, they're not
No, they're not
controlled.
placebo-controlled.
Yeah, it's like there is no,
Yeah, almost never.
Yeah, so I think from a pharmaceutical standpoint, I think people have apprehension to go to places and get these trials because there's a perception that when a new drug comes to market, they might not get it. And I think a lot of times we're the ones running the trials at the academic centers. We have no interest in not treat. We know what happens to cancer when you don't treat it. But the phase 1 trials, you're getting the drug. Like we're finding out if it's safe mostly, although we do think it's effective. And to your point, once people are on a higher phase of trial, it's pretty uncommon that we have just like a straight up placebo. It still happens occasionally in oncology, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, we have one ongoing right now, actually, at Nuvation. And you're right, it is rare, but for a very specific setting, it makes the most sense. But like I said, those are somewhat uncommon, and it's in a maintenance setting where patients have already received their standard of care. So after that standard of care, it's a watch and wait. So at that point, we're randomizing them to placebo, and our product, which is a stafusidenib, and it's an IDH1 inhibitor.
Yeah, you raise a good caveat to that is, a lot of times we'll do a primary therapy and then we'll hold off.
Yeah.
And sometimes you want to figure out, should we escalate or should we not?
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you corrected me here that is an example where the placebo is actually the normal.
Is it right?
That's what we usually do.
Exactly. So we think in that, we're just initiating the study now. So we think in this instance, as a patient, you say, well, maybe I have a 50-50 chance. I don't, either my decision is not to participate in this study and I receive nothing, just obviously routine visits, or I have a 50-50 chance of receiving something that could, delay my time to disease progression or recurrence.
No, it's funny. I wasn't even thinking in my mind about the maintenance setting trials, which we have now. Yeah.
So phase 1 trials, Kerry, how long between a phase 1 trial and FDA approval? What does that time frame look like? And I'm sure that's a really broad, open-ended question, but I'm always curious to know what people's responses are.
It really comes down to it can be as short, believe it or not, it's like 4 years.
Which seems like a really long time.
I know. In our world, that is just lightning speed. I know it sounds crazy. But sometimes it can take almost a year to get certain clinical sites open. So when you think about that, just the administrative part, and hopefully over, that will continue to get better. But so 4 years from beginning to end is, breakneck speed.
Okay.
But then I think, still 8 to 10 years is not unreasonable.
Wow.
From initial IND to approval, commercial approval. You think just about the time it takes to get to the IND, an FDA review, once you have all the data together, takes 8 to 12 months. So, they're working the best they can to speed it up, especially in oncology. But yeah, these are long timelines. Yeah, but if you have incredibly effective therapy, I would say that, that's where you can get in the 4 to 5 year time frame. Something that's breakthrough, and FDA will recognize that and partner with the company as much as possible. And sometimes it's not even the FDA, it's the constraints on the company, a small company even, because you're staging your investment in manufacturing development and, and certain things that people won't appreciate on the back, kind of in the background. You can't just, they won't, and this is the right thing to do, approve a product that's not ready to be out and kind of the commercial settings. So, anyway.
So you brought up when you were talking about picking certain locations to set up clinical trials, I've always wondered how does that process work? How do you decide where you're going to do clinical trials? When I look at clinical trial location lists sometimes, I am very perplexed on where these locations came from and why they are on this list. So any insight you could give would be amazing, because I'm sure a lot of listeners are curious.
Okay, so there is a lot that goes into it, and it depends sometimes on where you are in your phase of development. So you may see a lot of phase 1, let's say first in human studies, start in Australia. Why is Australia? Well, the kind of the regulatory requirements to move into phase 1 in Australia is a lower bar. I'm not going to say it just doesn't mean that it's not safe. It's not safe, but I know people say, why? Well, there's that reason. I've worked on programs where the first in human did move into Australia just because of the difference in requirements. In oncology, depending on the type of therapy, the complexity of the therapy that's being delivered, and the type of patients you're looking to enroll, you go to the large academic centers, Dana-Farber, Memorial Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, and that Mayo, all the big names, because with rare tumor types, that may be where they get referred out of the community, and that's where the trials, they find their home. And that's not necessarily the most convenient for patients, and we understand that. And then we look to where is their experience in the community to participate in a clinical trial. So when a clinical site decides they want to participate, there's a mutual agreement that has to happen between a clinical site, the investigator, and the company. And the company needs to have full oversight, and they need to attest that we are selecting an investigator in a clinical site that has the appropriate training and understanding of what it means to participate in a clinical trial. So it could be that you have a great doctor down the street, but he or she has never participated in a clinical trial, and we have a complex therapy, and maybe they don't even have the right kind of equipment, processes to handle this therapy. And it's unfortunate, but they're just not going to be a site, even though you think this is such a great doctor. And so some of them just are disqualified on that basis alone. They just don't have the experience or the infrastructure to support a trial. But then there are more and more in the community who I think are, want to serve patients and want to participate in the clinical trial process. It is labor intensive. It's a lot of work for investigators and sites. They have to collect a lot of data. Our protocols can be very complex. So they do need to be staffed and I would say educated and have a good understanding of what that means to participate in a trial.
And building on that, Kerry, you've worked in pharma and you've seen a large scape, the full landscape really of different companies, how different practice styles are. And not speaking in regards to your current company specifically, but what is the, I guess, field standard for how that work is compensated? Like, someone actually, Samantha, I think it was you asking me, like, are physicians paid to put people on trials? Like, does it increase your paycheck? Because patients sometimes feel like there's a lot of pressure to go on one trial or another. And I'm just curious, like, how does the pharmaceutical industry in general approach,
Right.
that work that is done?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are guardrails. So there are a few kind of, I guess, different ways that we can, contain costs, but also we're not paying an amount that's inappropriate, and that could be biasing and cause behavior that could lead to fraud. I guess that's what you kind of, it kind of comes right down to. So,
or bias,
or bias,
kind of, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think what FDA is kind of going after is, and there's instances of this where they're just generation of fraudulent data, because the more patients, the more money, and et cetera. So, right. And probably the companies weren't mindful about how much they should be paying. So we have what's called out of the FDA a Financial Disclosure Act. So for all of the studies that help define the efficacy and safety of the drug, we need to collect financial disclosure on at least all of the lead and principal investigators, and many times the sub-investigators. If they've had a meaningful participation in gathering patient data, seeing patients. And so if they've received consulting fees above a certain threshold, they need to disclose that. If they have any stock ownership in the company, if they have any inventor rights associated with the drug, that we need to collect that and submit that with our marketing application. So FDA can look to see, Dr. Smith is an inventor on the on the IP, and if this is approved, they stand to, um, they'll receive a windfall. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at the data that was generated out at Dr. Smith's site. So that's one. And then so that's kind of the FDA view. And then also just we look to pay fair market value for these investigators and the institutions that they work for. I mean, many of them are not independent, right? And it's really the institutions setting the fees with overhead, et cetera. So it's more at that institution level and not, in fact, at the investigator level.
So to say, like, by and large, when an investigator enrolls a patient, they don't get paid, like their salary doesn't increase or something.
No, it trickles down. It really trickles down.
Yeah, I was like, it doesn't for me. So if you can tell me where that's happening.
Yeah.
I think that's a really big misconception, though. Very big misconception.
Oh, yeah. No, we don't write the check. Again, there are areas of clinical development in different, not oncology, where you have clinical research centers, and that's what they do, and they make money, maybe a few physicians in the practice, on diabetes, pain, et cetera. But here, we're writing a check, and then that gets distributed.
Yeah, and this is something I've tried to, have more conversations with Samantha about from my perspective as the person enrolling people on trials. Because, no matter what you do when you're involved in interpersonal relationships or there's anything to gain at all, for example, publication or something, there's always going to be some sort of implicit bias. And we're acknowledging that. Like, I know if I am a consultant for some group or if I help develop a trial that I have authorship on, I'm probably going to be more likely to put someone on that trial, or at least that's my inclination. And for me as a provider, it forces me to be more objective about what the data is. More often than not, we chose that trial for a reason. We opened it because we thought it was a good idea. So that's how that came to be. And I think it's not the perception that we're getting kickbacks from companies or we get more money. I think that belief is out there. I don't know what to do to dispel that belief. I guess in public institutions, our salaries are public.
Mm-hmm.
But so you can just look up our salaries, and
I did that today. Not yours, but someone else's.
So you will be very confident we are not getting kicked back by pharma when you look that up.
Well, and I'd say at the institution level, I mean, that'd be incredibly difficult to try to pull off nowadays. And I in my experience, it's driven by the science. It's driven by the promise and the hope of that science. Money is at the administrator level. I at least in my experience.
Yeah, and you were mentioning the disclosure forms. I fill out a ton of those, because we fill those out all the time. And when we're signing on the forms to be the principal investigator for a study, the administrators hand those, like, I'm told what to do. There's very clear institutional practices, and, their lawyers talk to the pharmaceutical lawyers. My wife's a lawyer. I know very much. She's a contract lawyer. So I know very much how all this goes. And then, us minions are told what to do. So yeah, it definitely happens above our pay grade, so to speak.
It's too bad that that's maybe the prevailing impression, but that's definitely that is not happening.
Yeah, and whether it's in studies or even just prescribing patterns, this belief that your care teams are being paid for what they do, in my experience, that's not really the case. Like, what I prescribe is what I prescribe, and my paycheck doesn't notice. There's no difference.
So talking about successful clinical trials, apart from the obvious, like FDA approval, like that equals a clinical trial has been successful, are there other things that you kind of measure as a form of success?
for sure, if we think about success as efficacy, then that's great. But you have to deliver a product that has that right balance between efficacy and safety. So I think that success in the earlier stages may be that you have a tolerable product that you can move forward, especially if the tolerability is to a point where you think that you're getting a good amount of drug into, that's not maybe the best way to say it, but a good amount of drug into the patient so it can do what it needs to do, right?
Yes.
To kind of
Yep.
exert that maximum efficacy.
Yep.
And where patients can stay on, so they're going to get the durability. I think that's a success. If you need to come back every 2 weeks to get an infusion, you have to sit in an infusion chair for 2 hours every other week. Is that great for the patient? I mean, maybe we talk about first generation, next generation, and if the efficacy is that great, maybe a patient would tolerate that. But I think making it a win for the patient and their quality of life, I think is also really, really important. Something that we think about in patient convenience.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think about to that too, Kerry, is making sure the trial is initially designed right and the readouts are interpretable. Sometimes, I mean, people don't, I guess, have as much experience in interpreting trials, but you can have an effect from a medicine. But if we think there's a chance that effect could just be due to random noise, like one person just did a little bit better than another person, we have statistical ways to say we're pretty sure this is because the medicine is better. And if you don't have enough patients, or if something weird happens, you can say, oh, there's an effect difference, but we're just not sure if it's really the drug or not. That to me is just, those are the trials we look at and we're hurt by.
I know it's a really hard place to be in. I spent a number of years working in the cancer vaccine space, and I'd say we spent a lot of time in the deep gray. And deep gray. And it's because you'd see some responses and you'd never know why. You never quite know why, because that immunotherapy vaccine approach is not a direct hit to the tumor. It's kind of doing something to your immune system that you hope then does something to the cancer. Kind of changes your immune status in a favorable way. That's hard to measure directly. And so I think we're still trying to crack the code there. And but so that's hard. That's a really hard place to be. And sometimes I would just say the technology is not ready.
Yeah. And
or
sometimes
for understanding what's happening, we're just not ready.
Well, and sometimes you get a subpopulation of people, like some people in that trial did really well.
Yeah.
But it's not enough
and you can't
for approval.
No, and you don't know why.
But who are those people? Like what happened?
Exactly.
Samantha, you may not know this, but EGFR, that's a common mutation in lung cancer. One of the first trials for EGFR was negative using a targeted therapy, something that was blockbuster, did really, really well. And it was because they didn't know at the time that you had to have a mutation in EGFR
right
to be to generate response from it.
Yep.
They just gave it to everyone with lung cancer.
Oh,
And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and 10% did super, super well. But they had to look into that and be like, why did these people do so well? And we don't always do that with trials. We have some people that respond, but you have to have money, you have to have time, you have to have someone has to have the bandwidth. So that's how a lot of the driver mutant work began. I started one of my first research jobs was in the laboratory of the PI that evaluated that. So thinking critically really worked for lung cancer. But it's not always that easy that you can, sequencing just kind of became available and you could just say, hey, let's check.
Now
you don't always have the tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that can be frustrating. But look where the immunotherapy field is now. And, and hopefully there will be some success with the interplay between vaccine approaches and checkpoint inhibitors. But it, it all makes sense on paper. It really does. But I'm sure it will have its day.
When you take a chance on these things, to start up a trial is not trivial. Can you speak a little bit to the general ballpark costs that a pharmaceutical company is thinking of in a relatively small trial, not those 500 patient multi-site?
Easily over $100 million plus dollars. Well, in phase one phase one oncology studies, nowadays you're not just looking for safety, you are looking for an efficacy signal. So they've gotten larger. And I think that that's the right thing, because you're trying to match the biology of the product with the biology of the tumor that's harbored in the patient. So yes, it's safety, but you want to give enough of that patient experience to see if you have a tumor response, some promise. So usually $10 to $20 million.
Wow.
The base one. Yeah.
And this is usually through investors of sorts, or?
Well, it depends on the structure of the company. If you're a public company, you've raised money through going public, and you can kind of continue to raise money through public offerings, selling your stock and putting that money in the bank and using that to fund your development. As a private company, it's also investors, but it just is not necessarily as easy to get to that, to get to access to money as it is if you're a public company and can sell stock, or do different types of financing arrangements because you're a public company.
Yeah, I've always been interested. I have not been part of that world yet, or at least not very much. So this is just humoring my curiosity. For a private company who's not selling stock, like, who are these investors? Is there groups of investors that get together, like angel investor kind of things for small startups, or do people come to you? Like, I don't even know.
I would say angel investors are more on the rare. Some of those will start up around patient advocacy groups for very kind of rare pediatric conditions, diseases. And then they'll have angel investors. I mean, I've heard stories of parents of children with these rare, if they have financial means, they'll start with an angel investment, and then they'll get funds from, do a small kind of private placement, just to even move promising science and through various animal studies, et cetera, just to get a base of data to then take around to venture capitalists or those who specifically will invest in private healthcare companies. So that's I think at the kind of most basic level how that happens. But a lot of it is not through angel investing. Most of it is through venture capital firms where they focus on healthcare and willing to take a lot of risk.
I see. So, and do people have like there's a known list of these or do you just like knock door to door in San Francisco? And
there's a well-known list of who those are. A lot of them exist in the Boston, Cambridge area and out in San Francisco, where the hubs exist for biotech.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I didn't actually have a good sense for how that all came to be.
Yeah, I'm hardly an expert, but I've actually only ever worked for small public companies. So I have a better understanding of what that looks like, but have friends who've worked on the private side and just have learned through them.
Yeah, and I think there's this perception that like, oh, they're a pharmaceutical company. They have very, very deep pockets. There's always this like perception that they're like Scrooge McDuck swimming in their gold coins. And it sounds like that's probably not usually the case.
Yeah. Which is a great segue for the next question. Kyle, is to you, Kerry. Why do you think there is so much mistrust with the pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah. I saw that question. And I mean, look, I'm a patient myself for reasons not related to cancer and oncology, thankfully. But, so I kind of had to sit in the chair and say like, but, why is this so expensive? So I do think that we've probably not done a great job as an industry and telling the drug development story. But as I kind of started with, how do you soundbite that without seeming flip, and, be like, well, to manufacture this, it cost 100 million and the trials cost 300 million. And the animal studies are another 20 million. And I mean, it just sounds so absurd on the surface that you are making it up. But in reality, you're not making it up. If you really, I think, understood the complexity of novel drug development and biological development, it's there's no recipe. Everything is sort of new in many respects, especially with some of the breakthroughs that are happening nowadays. And the manufacturing, I think people forget how complex manufacturing and making these products can be and what it takes to move a process from the very early stage to a point where it's a reproducible, high yield, big scale process that patients can get access to. So I think we don't tell the story. So I think it's very opaque. We just throw, big numbers that sound improbable.
Sounds like fake money.
A lot, but I mean, it really is. I actually went to look. It was Deloitte. Their latest report is that the development cost for biopharmaceuticals $2.3 billion. I mean, that just sounds like you can't wrap your head around it. Now,
yeah, it's just fake money.
It's just fake money, right? But that accounts for, you have to account for 90% failures. You don't have successes without failures. And I think it's hard to, like, why am I as a patient paying for failures? Well,
so wait,
without
this is 90%
of the drugs, 90% of what products that go into an IND don't make it.
So these are products that are that have gotten to the point where they're being tested in humans.
Yeah.
And up to that point is many, many millions of dollars usually.
Yes. Yeah.
Of preclinical testing, evaluating things.
Exactly. Yep. So there's, it's hard to wrap your head around, I think, that concept of having to pay for the failures. But it's without that, we wouldn't have the successes. It's just, it's impossible. So I think the storytelling, and that leads to the storytelling is imperfect, and I think there are other players in the system that I think that contribute to high drug prices that maybe just come back to the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm hoping that I think that we're moving into a place of a bit more transparency when it comes to this topic, and and good transparency is good. I think transparency without context can be bad, which is is something we'll have to contend with. And so I hope that, with you, Samantha, patients who tell their story of their experience in working with pharmaceutical, being exposed to pharmaceutical companies, with you, Kyle, that it's, that these are not evildoers, and I think we have to be and embrace the transparency as much as we can. And that's my hope for the future. And there are some interesting, how do we say, cost plus RX, that are popping up, that are giving patients more transparency into pricing and more access. So I think we have to welcome that.
And you'll be happy to hear that when people ask me how much my medicines are before insurance, I'll tell them and they'll go, "How much? That's outrageous." And my comeback now is they are literally recouping their costs. Like, do you know how much it costs to
No,
create a drug
I know.
from trial to market? And then they kind of change their tone completely and they're like, "Oh, didn't think about that."
Well, and you don't know how long that drug's going to be prescribed for.
Right. And I comes off as whining from the company perspective, but we're really just trying to be, I think, transparent about that and again, to get to a favorable outcome for patients, an approved product. There are a lot of failures in its wake. And yeah, and also I would say when I look at what Nuvation Bio is doing on the patient assistance side of things for our product, our approved product, it is really a wraparound. I mean, we don't want a financial barrier to get in the way of patients getting access to an important treatment. So as this, this is our first commercial product, and with David Hung at the helm. I mean, he's incredibly patient-centric. He's a physician, oncologist, and yes, we are a business, but we have a lot of compassion, and I think that is hopefully coming through in our patient support and assistance programs that patients may not even be aware of that exist, that should be available at companies.
Yeah, I think there's a big gap in misunderstanding in terms of how much the pharmaceutical companies can and are willing to help out with financial assistance for their drugs. It's, I think, a big misunderstanding.
Yeah, and we should work to kind of correct that misunderstanding. And I know there may not, each company will be different and how much they lean into publicizing those kind of programs, but I know that we're very upfront and want to raise the awareness of the different ways that patients can access our product, and hopefully that financial barriers can be overcome.
Yeah, and emphasizing how I think meaningful it is for us to see those that dedication, I guess, to the protocols for providing drug for patients who can't afford it and things like that. When it takes 10 million, 100 million plus to get this drug approved, and in a competitive market, I don't think people appreciate how if you get a drug approved to treat, Samantha, you have HER2-driven lung cancer. If there's a drug approved to treat HER2-driven lung cancer, there's like 4 more in the wings getting ready for their own approvals or working for their own approvals. So you don't know how long your compound is going to be purchased for. And you have to recoup your costs in an unknown period of time. But even still, in that competitive environment, I've always had success reaching out to the drug companies who produce a given compound if a patient's really struggling to get access. And they know it's going to help them. More often than not, they show up, and my hat's off to that. I think, in my experience, it really has been patient centered, and we forget sometimes that the people on the other end who are working in pharma, they have family members who have died of cancer. Like they're not here by accident.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. I'm heartened to hear that.
So, in our last minutes here wrapping up, Kerry, is there anything new coming out of Nuvation that you want to make sure people know about?
Yeah, well, we've touched a little bit upon the product that we received approval for in June. I guess we've just mentioned it, not the product itself, but it's for a ROS1 driven non-small cell lung cancer in the advanced metastatic setting. And so that was exciting to move that product through the FDA approval process early, in fact. And, patients are now getting access to that, and we think having good responses. On the development side, I mentioned we have an IDH1 inhibitor that we've initiated a phase 3 trial. We're upgrading a phase 2 to a phase 3 trial, placebo-controlled blinded, in higher grade glioma patients that have already received their maintenance treatment, which is radiation and temozolomide. And there we're looking to see if we can delay progression or recurrence of that brain tumor. Brain cancers, and those a localized tumor. It's incredibly difficult to be successful in clinical trials in that setting. But our CEO, Dr. Hung, is incredibly committed to, and that's why I initially joined the company, is because there was a program in glioma. And so, unfortunately, that failed to move forward for safety reasons. And then we ended up licensing it in a different product for brain cancer. So, I guess this is really, I'm meant to be working again in this tumor type, because the unmet need is so high. But there's a reason why a lot of companies aren't working in brain cancer.
The glioblastomas are devastating. And thank you for all your work in ROS1. Right now we have Samantha co-hosting, but Ashley Holt has ROS1-driven lung cancer, a different co-host that we have. And, fortunately for us, she's stage 1 and had a resection, but at a previous podcast, and one we'll be following up on, she mentioned how she had tumor markers go positive recently. And, she had to consider going on actually your group's drug. So having that available,
yeah.
When previously, not too long ago, it was chemo. So thank you for your work there. And I can tell you firsthand, it matters to my patients. It matters to us here at Cracking Cancer, because that was a personal thing with Ashley.
It takes a village. There is a huge, huge, huge group of my coworkers, the inventors, all of that, the researchers, the investigators and patients. It is overwhelming what it takes, but it's so gratifying when it's it's successful and that it makes a difference for patients.
Absolutely. And if you could leave cancer patients and families with one message, what would that message be?
I guess what I've seen in specifically with these oncogenic driver mutations, and I'm 53 with a 12-year-old daughter. She just turned 12. So getting to appreciate the profile of patients with lung cancer with these oncogenic drivers. I see myself, potentially, and with your children, very active professionally or whatever. I think nowadays I see myself as still very much kind of young-ish. And the idea of having these therapies that patients can respond to for years and then maybe there's another therapy down the line that they can then respond to for years. In some respects, could we really turn certain cancer types into chronic diseases? I think it's not until recently that you could see this potential. And at the age of which, patients are diagnosed, I think that's so important. And that these are tolerable, that you're just not destroying your quality of life. So I guess it's that hope and encouragement to seek out clinical trials. I did join a clinical trial myself at one point, just to experience it. And it's demanding, but it's hopefully would benefit the patient, and it benefits the collective patients and the whole field and the science. So hope and consider clinical trials.
Well, wonderful sentiment. And Samantha, based on everything we've talked about today, if you could lead patients with one final sentiment, what would it be?
I'm going to echo Kerry. I don't really have any additional things to add other than what Kerry said. I think she summarized it perfectly.
All right. Good enough for us. Well, thank you both for joining. Again, Kerry Wentworth of Nuvation and Samantha Murrell of Cracking Cancer joining us today. If you like this episode, please do like and subscribe, and you can go to crackingcancer.org for more information. We will see you next time.
Great. Thank you so much. And best of luck, Samantha.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.